All right. In this lecture, we are going to talk about our general sensory system, or some ideas surrounding general sensation. So before we start, when you think about the term sense or sensory or sensation, what do you think about? So maybe pause the video, think for a second, maybe write a few things down about what you typically think of, or what's one thing that comes to mind when you think of the term sense or sensory or sensation. Okay. So we have our sensory nervous system, or the afferent, right, the afferent part of our sensory system, organized in a very specific way. Okay, so the two kind of broad, overarching classes of our sensory or afferent nervous system are the general sensation, or the general sensory nervous system, and then the special sensory nervous system, or our special senses. So when I asked you the question of what do you think of when you think senses, you probably thought of one of our, our main, our, five main senses. You might have thought of vision, or smell, or taste, or hearing, or equilibrium, or kind of any of these main senses that we typically think of. And that is true. That those are sensations. But in this lecture, we're going to look specifically at general sensations. So when you think of a general sensation, think of something that is a sensation in the sense that it's being something is stimulating a sensory receptor, and we may or may not perceive that sensation. So we'll talk about this in the next slide, but there is a difference between sensation and perception. We sense a lot of things in our body, but we do not perceive everything that we sense. Okay, so you can have sensation without perception, but if you have perception, you had sensation previously. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So in general, these general senses, or this general sensation that we're going to talk about in this lecture, surrounds the idea of something very broadly and widely distributed throughout the body. So like touch, or pain, or pressure, or vibration, or the detection of a change in temperature, or something like that, right? We can detect these changes throughout the body, right? You can feel touch and pressure on your head, you can feel it on your thorax, you can feel it on your arm, on your leg, on your back. It's distributed all throughout the body. In our next lecture that we'll do after this, we'll do special senses. And this will look at sensory receptors that are kind of aggregated and clumped in a specific region of the body. So things like our photoreceptors for sensing and responding to light, right? Those are associated only in our head, specifically with our eye and our retina, right? It's just in that one location. We don't see things or sense or detect light in our limbs or our trunk or anywhere else. It's dedicated to a specific region. So that's kind of the main differeces between general and special. So when we look at this graph here, this is how we can kind of break down and organize our sense receptors and our sensory nervous system in this kind of hierarchical organization. So in general, we have sensation, right? We have motor, and then we have sensory. So here we're talking about sensory. You can divide that into general and special, or specialized. And in this lecture, we're going to talk specifically about general. So for our general, there's two subtypes of general sensations. Okay, these can be somatic and visceral, meaning they can either come from the soma, the somatic, so meaning the body, so like our skin or our muscles or something like that, or they can come from visceral structures. Specifically, they can come from our internal organs. So we could have information come from our heart. It could come from our blood vessels. It could come from our kidney. It can come from our large intestine, small intestine, stomach, all these different things. So when you think of the term visceral or viscera, you should start to think organ. Okay, if you see the visceral nervous system, visceral sensation, that is a sensation, that is something coming from our internal organ. Okay, so think of an organ. All right. So when we look here, there is a difference between sensation and perception. So the idea of a sensation is occurring at the level of the sensory receptor. Okay, so you have a sensory receptor that detects pain. You have some that detect changes in temperature. You have some that detect actual like physical or mechanical distortions in the physical or in the sensory receptor. So a physical change. You have ones that detect pain. You have all these different types. The sensation is occurring at that level. So you have a stimulus. You have somebody pushing, and you have that sensory receptor responding to that person touching or pushing, okay, or the vibration, or whatever it may be, okay, or some painful stimulus, or a change in temperature. That's the sensation, okay. Whenever that signal, so the process of going from a stimulus pushing on a receptor to that receptor now sending action potentials, that process is called transduction, or you transduce it. Okay, so you have the stimulus. I'm poking you with a pin. It touches your skin. We went from the stimulus, which was the pin coming in, and it irritates and it stimulates your sensory receptors. When those sensory receptors start stimulating and start sending action potentials, that is this process of transduction. Okay, and the signal has been transduced. Now, if that signal goes back to the brain and it goes back to the postcentral gyrus, it goes to that primary somatosensory cortex of the postcentral gyrus, which is part of the parietal lobe. And if we are able to become aware of that, we are conscious of that, right? I touch you, you feel it, you actually know that I touched you, you are aware of it. That is this idea of perception. Okay, so like we said earlier, if you have perception, if you perceive something, then you obviously sensed it at the level of your sensory receptor. However, not everything that our body senses we become aware of, or we don't perceive it, right? So you're not aware of the minute small changes occurring in your occurring with your blood pressure at this very moment, right? Your blood pressure is slightly going up, it's slightly going down, right? That's a sensation via a baroreceptor or a type of mechanoreceptor, but you're not aware of that, right? You're not specifically feeling those changes in blood pressure, right? You're not being able to perceive and become aware of the small changes that are happening to the composition of the filtrate in your kidney, and the filtrate will ultimately become urine, right? You're not aware of those small changes of reabsorbing a little bit of water, excreting and getting rid of a little bit of water. You're not aware of those things, right? And so this is this idea that if you're aware of it, you're conscious of it, you have perceived it. If you are not aware of it, you're not conscious of it, then there is no perception. There's no perception that has occurred, but there may have still been a sensation. Okay, so keep this in mind moving forward. So what this is showing is our differences between somatic and visceral, right? So somatic, we said again, was coming from a region of the body like maybe our skin or our muscles or joints or something. Okay, so we have mechanoreceptors associated with our, or as a part of our somatic sensory system. Okay, so mechanoreceptors, as we'll see in a little bit, these are responding to physical, mechanical pressures and distortion of that receptor. So the receptor itself is physically manipulated, and it physically is pushed on, and it's moved, and it's distorted. That then generates an action potential to go back to the central nervous system, and we may perceive it. Right? We have other sensory receptors in our soma that are associated with temperature. Right? So we can detect changes. We have ones that are associated with something called proprioception. Okay, so proprioception is our idea and our awareness of our limbs and our joints and our tendons and ligaments in three-dimensional space. Right, so you can close your eyes, stick your arm out, and bring your finger to your nose with your eyes closed pretty accurately. Right, you could have your arm out, eyes closed, and bring your finger to your ear or to your chin or to your forehead. You can do this relatively accurately and consistently because of proprioceptors in your muscles, in your joints, in your ligaments and tendons that tell our brain through our cerebellum where those limbs are, where those structures are, where those muscles are in three-dimensional space. When we look at our visceral organs, so we look at the heart, or we look at the stomach, or we look at something like that, we find some of the same receptors, but sometimes different receptors are in different quantities or different concentrations or different distributions when you look at visceral sensory receptors. Okay, so they can monitor stretch, so there can be baroreceptors, maybe monitoring pressure. You have chemoreceptors that detect changes in chemicals in the blood or in the filtrate or something like that. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions. You have ones detecting changes in temperature, so thermoreceptors. And you also have ones that are detecting pain, so nociceptors, right? Now, one thing about our internal organs is that they typically have fewer or more widely distributed thermoreceptors, pain receptors, which we'll call nociceptors. And what this results in is it results in, and we'll also talk about something known as a receptive field, but the lack of these things in visceral organs or visceral structures means that we generally are unable to very precisely localize where certain sensory information is coming from, right? So you may have, if we think about our somatic sensory receptors, so like on our skin, right? You can have your eyes closed and I could poke you on your back, in your low left back, and you would know exactly where I poked you, right? You could pretty well touch exactly where I touched you or where I poked you. But whenever we have pain coming from an internal organ or something, we can't necessarily pinpoint exactly where that's coming from, right? We can't say, oh, that pain is coming exactly from my jejunum, which is a part of our small intestine, or it's coming exactly from my pancreas, right? We just know it's hurting somewhere in my abdomen, right? We say, my stomach hurts. It's just somewhere in that area, right? So we can't precisely localize it, but we can generally localize it, okay? And this will become important or it will become important in a clinical setting because based on where, regarding this visceral sensation, where this generalized pain or sensation is coming from, you can begin to think about what organs may be involved, right? So if somebody's having diffuse, poorly localized pain in their right upper quadrant, well, you can think that may possibly be gallbladder, right? Maybe. It's not always, but it could be. If they're having diffuse, poorly localized pain in their right lower quadrant, well, that may be appendix, right? So you can start to think about what organs are located where, and based on that and where pain is coming from, what potentially may be going wrong, okay? So those are general senses and general sensory receptors and general sensory nervous system. For our special senses, and again, we'll have a separate lecture on this, this has to do with our special senses, the 5 senses we typically think about. So our sense of smell, our sense of vision, hearing, equilibrium, and our sense of taste, right? And so we'll talk about each of these senses in more detail whenever we do our special senses lecture. But in general, for now, know that special senses, in contrast with generalized senses and general sensory receptors, these are localized in a specific region, right? And if you think about all your senses, these special senses, they're all localized in organs in our head, right, or our face. So we have, for smell, it's in our nose. For vision, it's associated with our eye. For hearing and balance or equilibrium, it's associated with our ear. And then for our sense of gustation or taste, it's associated with our tongue, okay? So generalized sensory receptors, touch, pressure, pain, distributed throughout the body. Special sensory receptors are located within a specific organ, a specific region of the body, and those are generally associated with our head, okay? So we've talked about some general classes here. Now we can categorize sensory receptors based on a couple of different criteria, okay? So one of these is going to be the type of stimulus it responds to. So does it respond to pressure? Does it respond to temperature? Does it respond to pain? Does it respond to chemicals? All these different things. We can also categorize sensory receptors based on where the stimuli they respond to, where it comes from. So is the information or the stimuli, is it coming from inside the body or is it coming from outside the body? Okay. And then we can also categorize sensory receptors based on what the actual sensory receptor looks like, and we'll talk about something in a little while called adaptation. So we can classify sensory receptors based on how quickly they adapt to constant stimuli. So how quickly they kind of get used to that stimuli. All right. So if we look at some important terms related to sensory nervous system, one of these terms is known as sensory modality. Right. And so a sensory modality has to do with the stimulus or the one thing that a sensory receptor is going to respond to. All right. So all of our sensory receptors, we'll see in a little bit, they're called nociceptors, or they're called thermoreceptors, or osmoreceptors, or chemoreceptors. This kind of prefix, chemo or nociceptor, noci or thermo, this responds to the specific stimulus that sensory receptor responds to. And so that stimulus, that's the sensory modality. That is the one thing that receptor responds to more than other stimuli, right? So you can see if we look here, you can have things like, maybe somebody pinching you, or pressure, okay, or touch. You could have something maybe like pain. You could have the sun is representing light, right? So our photoreceptors. You could have light touch, so with this feather, or you could have changes in temperature, right? So something is very hot, something is very cold, all right? So again, keep in mind the sensory modality is the stimulus that one sensory receptor is responding to, at a greater rate than all the other stimuli. Okay, and specific receptors are good at recognizing and responding to specific stimuli. So we can categorize sensory receptors based on where their stimuli that they respond to, where it comes from. And so if the stimuli is coming from outside of the body, then we're going to call that sensory receptor an exteroreceptor. All right, so the term extero simply refers to the fact that the stimulus is coming from outside the body or in our external environment, right? So if you think about the fact that it's responding to something in the external environment, then the location of those sensory receptors are going to be at or near where the stimulus is coming from. So if it's coming from outside the body, the receptors are going to be situated near the outside of the body or close to the body surface, right? So we find a lot of these exteroreceptors associated in our or associated with our skin, right? So our skin is it's relatively superficial, right? It's very superficial, in fact, and so it's going to respond to these stimuli that are coming from the outside, coming from the external environment. So this could be something like pressure, right? We have pressure coming down onto our skin from clothing, from leaning against something, from somebody grabbing onto us, whatever it may be, right? We could have light touch, we could have vibration, we could have stretching of the skin, whatever it is, whatever it may be, it's coming from outside of the body. So it's sensed by an exteroreceptor. And again, exteroreceptor, that is a very broad category, and there are specific subtypes of sensory receptors that fall under the category of exteroreceptor. Okay, so if you know exteroreceptor, then you know this other one because it's responding to stimuli coming from within the body. So if an exteroreceptor is responding to information in the external environment, then an interoreceptor is responding to changes coming from inside the body or related to the internal environment. Okay, so these can be further categorized and further divided into visceral and somatic. Okay, so again, like we talked about just previously, when you hear the term viscera or visceral, you should think organs. Okay, so these are going to be receptors located deep within the body that are responding to internal changes, internal stimuli that are specifically associated with our body's organs. Okay, so this image you see in the top right, this is showing this region right up here. This is showing a baroreceptor, something known as the carotid sinus, that can sense changes in blood pressure. Okay, this is an internal receptor. Okay, so it's an interoreceptor, and it is associated with our blood vessel, which is considered an internal organ, right? It's associated with our cardiovascular system. So this is going to be a baroreceptor, but more broadly, it's considered an interoreceptor, or a visceral interoreceptor. Now, if we had a internal receptor, so an interoreceptor associated with part of our soma, or our skin or our muscles or something, then this is going to be a somatic interoreceptor. And again, it's responding to stimuli coming from within the body. So this is like our proprioceptors. Okay, so we mentioned proprioceptors earlier. Proprioceptors are responding to the or giving us awareness of our location of our joints and our limbs and our ligaments and our tendons and whatnot in three-dimensional space. Okay, so somatic interoreceptor coming from the body wall, muscles, something like that. And again, it's responding to information coming from within the body. So the stretch of the muscle, right, for this proprioception, the stretch of the muscle, that's an internal stimulus. The muscle is inside the body, and the sensory receptor is picking that sensation up. Okay. All right. So we can look at a few more specific types based on the sensory modality that the receptor responds to. So if you recall, sensory modality was the specific stimulus that the receptor is going to respond to. So thermoreceptors is one example. So we could have changes in temperature come from the outside, come from the inside. We have a region in our brain known as the hypothalamus, and this is essentially where our internal thermostat is located. There are various nuclei in the hypothalamus, and one of those is responsible for kind of setting our internal body temperature. Okay. Now, we'll talk more later about thermoreceptors, but in general, we have more cold receptors, okay, than we do warm receptors, okay? The actual structure of the receptor isn't really different. It's just going to respond to different temperatures. Whenever the receptor is stimulated, we'll see later that ions can flow in it generates an action potential. That action potential travels back to the central nervous system, and we're able to perceive that as a hot temperature, a warm temperature, a cold temperature, so on and so forth. Okay. Now, we'll also talk about briefly in a little bit this idea of adaptation. So how quickly does a receptor respond to a constant stimulus? Okay. And we'll see that thermoreceptors are what are known as phasic receptors, or they're very rapidly adapting, right? So you could stick your hand in water, and initially you notice the temperature difference, the major difference, but after a while you kind of get used to it and you don't really notice it anymore. So this is this idea that we respond, or we adapt very quickly to changes in temperature. Okay, and there are different types of receptors that are rapidly adapting. There are others that are slowly adapting. Okay, so another example is a chemoreceptor. Right, so the term chemo. So for thermo meant temperature. For chemo is referring to chemicals. So these are going to be receptors that respond to changes in the chemicals in our environment, right? So this could be things in our external environment, like chemicals from food, chemicals from a cologne, chemicals from from perfume, from an air freshener, something like this. Or it could be a chemical coming from the internal environment. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, right? And so this is another example of where you could have an internal or an entero chemoreceptor, or you could have an exteroreceptor, an external chemoreceptor, right? So for our olfactory nerve, our first cranial nerve, it is responding to this is associated with our sense of smell, of course, olfaction. It's responding to chemicals in our environment, right? Whenever we inhale, we bring in chemicals in through the nasal cavity. It will then stimulate nerve endings. Whenever it stimulates nerve endings, that generates an action potential, or what we'll call a receptor potential, generates an action potential, travels along the axon of this olfactory neuron, and ultimately back to our temporal lobe, where we then perceive that as some type of smell, right? It may be a strong smell, a faint smell, a good smell, a bad smell, but this idea is that it is being sensed by the chemicals in the air, okay? And then we can perceive it at the level of the brain, right? So we also have nociceptors and mechanoreceptors, right? So nociceptors, these are going to be very important ones that we'll talk about in more detail later, but nociceptors are those that detect painful stimuli, or a painful stimulus. Okay. Now, there are different types of nociceptors that respond to different stimuli. So they could respond to temperature. Some may respond to a physical change in the receptor, so the physical distortion of it. It may respond to chemicals in the environment as well. All right. Now, we'll see that we have different types of pain that we can categorize differently, and you already know this because you've heard of sharp pain, aching pain, burning pain, dull pain. These are different types of specific pain perceptions that we're aware of. And the reason why some are considered sharp, some are considered dull and throbbing or aching, depends on the type of fiber or the type of axon that transmits that pain. We'll talk about two different types. There's A fibers and there's C fibers. All right. A fibers transmit very sharp, acute pain. C fibers transmit more dull, aching, chronic pain. Okay. With our nociceptors, we talked about this idea of, or briefly mentioned, we'll go into more detail later, but this idea of adaptation, so rapid adaptation or slow adaptation. These are slowly adapting receptors, right? So you're doing something that is causing you pain. You're probably not going to get used to that, right? You're going to continue to perceive it as pain until you get rid of that stimulus. Okay. All right. The next one is a mechanoreceptor. Okay. Mechanoreceptors respond to mechanical stimuli. Okay, or some mechanical stress, mechanical manipulation of that sensory receptor. So the term mechanos meaning mechanical. So whether it's a touch, a pressure, vibration, other type of movement, it is responding to this stimulus. Okay. So examples here are touch receptors, baroreceptors that detect pressure, osmoreceptors that detect changes in the concentration of our blood, and proprioceptors. And we've talked about proprioceptors a few times. We will look in more detail at specific types of mechanoreceptors, and we'll see that a lot of these are located within the skin. All right, they're located within the skin. So we will stop here, and we will pick up with part 2 talking about the structure of different types of sensory neurons, and then we will continue from there.